When people scroll through the Epstein files, one thought keeps rising above the noise. How can so many powerful names surface, and yet almost nothing truly happens? This is not simply a failure of justice. It is a lesson about how power is organized. The story around Jeffrey Epstein is often reduced to one man and his crimes. But that framing is comfortable. It allows the public to locate evil in a single figure and move on. What is far more disturbing is what the files quietly reveal about how accountability weakens as influence expands. A name appearing in a document feels powerful to ordinary people because visibility is the only weapon most people have. But visibility is not how elite systems operate. Influence is processed through institutions, legal filters, political calculations, and reputational management. And inside those systems, public outrage is not automatically translated into action. This is why the question is not really who appears in the files. The real question is, who decides what appearance is allowed to become a consequence? This video is not about accusing individuals. It is about understanding a pattern where exposure becomes entertainment, where attention replaces accountability, and where powerful structures quietly learn how to survive scandal without ever confronting its roots. If you want to understand why names can circulate endlessly while justice barely moves, you must stop looking at personalities. You must start studying how power protects itself. One of the biggest mistakes people make when reading the Epstein files is assuming that public knowledge automatically creates justice. It does not. What the case surrounding Jeffrey Epstein reveals is a hard truth most societies are uncomfortable admitting. Visibility and accountability belong to two very different systems. The public operates in a world of attention. Institutions operate in a world of procedure, power balance, and risk management. When a name appears in leaked documents or media investigations, it enters the public arena. But consequences are decided somewhere else entirely, inside legal frameworks, prosecutorial discretion, political calculation, and institutional self-preservation. Those spaces are not guided by outrage. They are guided by feasibility. For a case to move forward, it must survive layers of filtering. Evidence must meet very specific standards. Jurisdiction must be clear. Cooperation between agencies must exist. Witnesses must be protected. And above all, the investigation must not destabilize forces that the system itself depends on to function. This is where many scandals quietly collapse. Not because nothing serious happened, but because proving what happened becomes legally and strategically expensive. A person's name can circulate for years without crossing the threshold that allows prosecutors to act. Association alone does not meet the burden of proof. Presence in social networks does not establish criminal responsibility. Even proximity to wrongdoing is often legally insufficient without testimony, documentation, and direct linkage to specific acts. And there is another layer people rarely consider. Once a case becomes politically sensitive, it stops being evaluated only on legal merit. It begins to carry institutional cost. Careers, diplomatic relationships, funding streams, and organizational credibility suddenly become part of the equation. At that point, investigations are no longer only about truth. They become about containment. This is why exposure feels powerful but often produces frustration instead of justice. Public attention can reveal a problem. It cannot force institutions to absorb the damage required to resolve it. Understanding this difference is essential, because until you recognize how accountability is filtered through power, you will keep mistaking noise for progress and disappointment for failure without seeing the machinery that decides what is allowed to move forward at all. One of the quiet reasons so many names can appear in the Epstein files without leading to serious consequences is not confusion about what happened. It is conflict over what would be disrupted if the full network were confronted. The moment an investigation moves beyond one individual and begins to trace patterns of access, facilitation, and protection, it enters dangerous territory. Not because truth becomes harder to recognize, but because responsibility becomes harder to isolate. The case surrounding Jeffrey Epstein shows how quickly a legal process can become entangled with political, financial, and institutional interests. Each serious line of inquiry connects to people who hold influence in different sectors. That web creates resistance long before any public obstruction appears. In practice, investigations are constrained by resources, jurisdictional boundaries, and legal mandates. But when influence is layered into the picture, another pressure quietly emerges: institutional exposure. Prosecutors and agencies do not operate in a vacuum. Their funding, leadership, appointments, and future authority are shaped by the same political and administrative systems that may be affected by the outcomes of high-level investigations. This creates an environment where the scope of inquiry is carefully managed. The result is not necessarily a deliberate cover-up. It is something subtler. Investigations are narrowed to what can be proven with minimal institutional fallout. Lines of inquiry that threaten wider disruption tend to lose priority. Attention is redirected toward actors whose prosecution will not destabilize powerful alliances. This is why public focus often centers on a single figure, while the surrounding ecosystem quietly dissolves from legal view. The issue is not the absence of wrongdoing. It is the presence of too many interconnected consequences. Once accountability begins to endanger multiple centers of power at once, justice becomes structurally fragile. It must pass through systems designed to preserve continuity, stability, and legitimacy. And this is the uncomfortable reality most people do not want to accept. Legal systems are built to enforce rules. They are also built to protect the institutions that make enforcement possible. When both objectives collide, enforcement rarely wins without extraordinary political will. That is why scandals involving powerful networks so often produce limited outcomes, even when public suspicion remains high long after the headlines fade. One reason consequences struggle to follow the Epstein files is not because people lack information. It is because speaking carries a different kind of risk at high levels of influence. In the world surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, the most powerful form of pressure is rarely legal. It is reputational. Careers in politics, finance, media, and public life are built on credibility, trust, and access. Once those disappear, professional life often collapses completely. This changes how people calculate danger. For an insider, the question is not only whether a statement is true. It is whether the cost of saying it is survivable. When your work depends on donors, boards, party leadership, agencies, investors, or sponsors, speaking openly does not just invite legal scrutiny. It threatens the entire structure that keeps your position alive. Relationships that once created opportunity can instantly become barriers. Invitations stop. Calls go unanswered. Networks quietly reorganize without you. This is how silence becomes rational. Not because people approve of wrongdoing, but because the consequences of honesty are immediate and personal, while institutional accountability is slow and uncertain. Another problem is memory. Most high-level relationships stretch across decades. People share travel, meetings, private conversations, informal deals, and off-record arrangements. Over time, professional life becomes layered with moments that were never designed to be publicly explained. When investigations begin, uncertainty itself becomes dangerous. Individuals do not always know what others might reveal, interpret, or reconstruct. That uncertainty produces caution. And caution, repeated over years, becomes culture. This is why very few insiders step forward clearly and consistently when scandals involve powerful circles. It is not only fear of prison. It is fear of becoming untouchable in the wrong way, professionally erased, socially isolated, and permanently distrusted. The Epstein files expose this uncomfortable reality. Modern power does not rely on violence to protect itself. It relies on dependence. When your status, income, and future all depend on the same ecosystem, breaking silence feels less like courage and more like professional suicide. And in such an environment, truth does not disappear. It simply becomes too expensive to carry. The frustration many people feel after reading the Epstein files comes from a simple belief: if enough people are angry, something must change. But public anger and institutional pressure are not the same force. News cycles move quickly. Public attention rises sharply and then shifts to the next crisis. Institutions, however, operate on long timelines and internal procedures that are insulated from emotional pressure. For elite accountability to become unavoidable, it must threaten something concrete. Elections, funding, leadership stability, regulatory authority, legal exposure, or international relationships must be placed at risk. Without those pressures, public outrage becomes background noise rather than leverage. Another factor is narrative control. Once a scandal becomes difficult to deny, attention is often redirected towards simplified storylines that reduce complexity and narrow responsibility. Public debate focuses on personalities, shocking details, and moral outrage, while institutional questions quietly fade from view. This allows the broader structure to remain untouched. As long as the system can frame the crisis as isolated behavior rather than structural failure, it can absorb reputational damage without reforming itself. The Epstein files therefore illustrate a painful lesson. Visibility creates awareness, but only sustained institutional pressure creates consequences. Without mechanisms that force organizations to act against their own comfort and stability, public anger alone rarely reaches the level where real accountability becomes unavoidable. The Epstein files leave us with one uncomfortable conclusion. They do not mainly expose criminals. They expose how accountability weakens when influence becomes dense and interconnected. What happened around Jeffrey Epstein is disturbing, but what should worry you more is how easily systems learn to survive scandal without correcting what produced it. Names can circulate forever. Consequences require institutions willing to damage their own alliances. And that is rare. So if you truly want to understand power, stop waiting for outrage to fix it. Start studying the structures that quietly decide what justice is allowed to reach, and what it is designed to protect.